We have one more week. That's next week. And some of you may say, well, I don't need to be there because I'm not a veteran or I didn't care for a veteran, but you might have somebody that is a veteran. So feel free to come. But next week is our last one. And it's been a tremendous, sorry?
For this year.
For this year, yeah. We said that last year, our last one, but it wasn't a one and done. And last year we thought 10, that was a lot. So this year we did 12 because when we're trying to pick out of 50 different topics, we whittle it down to 12. And it was amazing. And I would like maybe the VA to share a little bit of how this is going to be on video at some point. It's not on, but you've seen that they've all been recorded. And for you, for your friends, for your family, it might be something that you would want. So I'm going to let Terj explain how this is going to work.
Hello. So we have like the second and the third videos done and about to go live on YouTube. And so we have a YouTube channel and it's the @ Sheridan VA as in an MC for medical center. So VA MC. And what'll happen is we'll be putting them up there. You'll be able to find them by like probably looking up AARP or looking up Holy Name Church or looking up the VA, but they'll be on the VA site on our YouTube channel. And then you are able to watch them and you can go right from where you're watching it and then share it with someone or a family member far away or whatever so that they can see it. So it'll be a great resource for folks. So if tonight, a couple of your friends didn't make it, they're not here tonight because of the weather, they'll be able to see it. We'll have it up there. Hopefully before the end of the year, we should have all the videos up and online. So
Could we maybe next week bring a little
a paper to give away?
Yes.
Yes, I'll do that for you guys. Okay.
Okay, so that's going to be awesome. Yes, thank you, VA, for doing that. So we always like the feedback, and I'm just saying a few of these things now because I feel like next week somebody might say, oh, I don't need to go because it's VA and I don't want to miss you and not tell you some of these announcements that I had, but we want you to be able to connect. And we really feel like it's important. A lot of you come in and say, oh, I don't see someone here. Someone said tonight, oh, I don't see so-and-so here. Well, you start missing people. And what we would love is if you connect with one another, or if you want to say, hey, Susan, could I get your number? Or your contact information, because I really enjoy visiting with you. So do that with one another because you connect and camaraderie. I mean, when I did my support groups, people came to see how others were doing. So if there's someone you feel like you've connected with or like you'd like to know how they're doing, ask them so that you guys can connect, because we would not give out your information if somebody called. So if you want to connect with someone, we really encourage you to do that. I have a few little things here before I introduce our speaker. You all got one of these, right? You didn't, Teresa has them back there, but I wanted to do this little community, TEA, but because it was December, I thought Cocoa for Caregivers seemed really appropriate. And so partnered with Sugarland Ridge, Cascades of Sugarland Ridge. So we'll do it in their dining room. We'll do it in the afternoon at 2:00 on December 13th. And just come and enjoy and take a break. We'll have refreshments and cocoa, and then Abby Taylor. Some of you may know Abby Taylor. Abby Taylor is, I can say, legally blind. She has written 2 books. And one of the books was on caregiving. After she got married, her husband, I believe, had a stroke, and she cared for him for a long time before he passed. But she doesn't even know that we have this care. She was just going to be there for Sugarland Ridge, but now she's going to entertain the rest of us. Let's see, my other brain health, all those little table tents that you have that you've been seeing for the last 12 weeks. Those are for you to remind you of the 5-6 pillars of brain health that AARP puts out: sleeping, eating, physical exercise, all of these things. Well, we have extras and we have them back in the back. They're not folded like a little tent, but you can take them home and you can fold them, put them on your table, put them somewhere where it just reminds you to take care of yourselves. That's what those are for, so feel free. I think that's all I have, Susan, and I can I want to say thank you to our dinner sponsor. Sandy Mills is not here tonight, but Sandy is our dinner sponsor for the night. So, and with that, I'd like to introduce our speaker. I knew him first as Dr. Greg Moreno, oncologist at the hospital, and loved him there. And then he became a deacon at our church here. And so he can be Deacon Greg or Dr. Greg, or you have a lot of titles.
Just plain Greg.
Or just plain Greg, but anyway, please welcome Dr. Greg Moreno.
Well, thank you. I think this is a wonderful program. And it honors all of us to be here, but it certainly honors Susan, and it certainly, of course, coming in today, really felt that in my throat, a lump in my throat, that John isn't with us, but he actually is with us as we gathered this evening, and I always keep him in my prayers. I'm as I was introduced, I'm a physician. I'm a hematologist oncologist, and I also do palliative care. And I work, I'm considered a full-time physician, although I don't work full-time, at the Native Hospital. It's in Anchorage, Alaska. And it's where I was before I came here to put together the Welch Cancer Center. And it was a wonderful mission to go up there to develop a program for people who really didn't have anything, and to meet the challenges of providing cancer care, and then the ultimate challenge to provide palliative care for people that lived hundreds of miles, sometimes over 1,000 miles from the medical center in Anchorage. So what I wanted to talk about is a little bit about that experience, not directly. I'm not going to tell a story, but to talk about end-of-life care issues and how to make end-of-life decisions. I'm also going to just for a moment. I'm not really sure what's happened to the large muscles in my legs, but if I stand for a long period of time, I'll start to get cramps in my legs. We think it might be from one of the heart medicines that I take. So we're not quite sure yet, but I'm just going to sit down if that happens. So if I do that, it's because I'm becoming the incredible vibrating deacon up here, and I don't want to do that. So Susan had given me a series of questions, and I think it's a good starting point. I don't know if any of you got those questions or if it just came to me, but I'm gonna try to cover them as well as I can. In Susan's letter to me, she said I had 25 minutes to do that. I can't do anything in 25 minutes. I can't even get dressed to go to work in 25 minutes. But I will give it a shot. And I'm told that there is someone here with a big hook who's going to grab me if I go beyond that. And so I'm going to do my very best. But one of the things that we wanted to talk about was the question, what is hospice care and when does one qualify for hospice? The second question was, how does one document and communicate their end-of-life decisions? Both very important questions. What are some of the end-of-life decisions, like resuscitation, intubation, hospitalization, etc.? And when should we call a priest or clergy? Well, you did call one. I'm right here, so I'm all set. And what care should be provided and what care should be considered extraordinary and can be discontinued or withheld? That is a very interesting question as well. I'm going to start out by saying that in order to develop an adequate end-of-life care program or plan for your patient, there are a couple of things that you need to know. One is you need to know what the diagnosis is. What's actually wrong with dad? What's going on with mom, or my wife, or my child even? What's going on? So we need to know the diagnosis, and we need to know the prognosis too. Is this curable? Is this fixable? Is this fixable only temporarily? And then what are the treatment options? And how are we going to follow things? So I'm giving you this from the standpoint of an oncologist. However, I think it's in force for other specialties as well. So people need to know, our patients need to know exactly what's going on with them, because without that information, how the heck can they make the right decisions? So a lot of this, in fact, probably all of it, people ask me over the years, how do you know what your patients want? And I said, well, first of all, I ask them. Second of all, I've developed a relationship with them. They know me well and I know them well. And believe me, this is a hard thing for me, because in Alaska, I'm working 2 weeks on or 3 weeks on and 2 weeks off, or 3 weeks off, because I go back and forth. And even though I'm connected to my staff and my patients by telephone, it's still not quite good enough. But it just has to be what it has to be. So what about hospice care? What is hospice care? Hospice care is holistic care of someone with an incurable or life-limiting illness. And what does hospice care do for patients? Well, it addresses the physical, psychological, emotional, and spiritual needs of the patient. That is the definition of a human being. That's a definition of a person. A person is physical. They're mental, if you will. What I mean by that is they're intellectual, they're emotional, and they're spiritual. And all of these things come into play when we're facing end-of-life issues. The goal of hospice care is relief of suffering, and whose suffering are they relieving with hospice care? Well, certainly the patient, but they're also taking care of the family and taking care of close friends. When should hospice care begin? Which is part of the question here as well. Ideally, it should be initiated at the time of diagnosis. But that's rarely done, unless, I shouldn't say that. Unfortunately, all too often, I'm going to stop and back up a second. When I went to Alaska, when I first arrived there in 1999, to look at how I was going to try to build a cancer program for the Native people, I wanted to see what was in place already, and I found preciously little. So when I came to work full-time, almost everything that I was seeing was advanced stage, to the point where it was really hard to develop a relationship with my patients because I didn't have time. They weren't living that long. It was very, very difficult. So again, as I said earlier, it should begin at diagnosis. And we didn't have a palliative care program at that time. Actually, we still don't in oncology, but we do at the hospital. But that was my biggest challenge, was how am I to not cure cancer or treat cancer so much as how was I to take care of the patients suffering, their symptom management and their families. How was I supposed to do that? It was really hard because of the lack of opportunity at the time that we had. So it actually cannot happen on day one unless things, I do see patients still who are very poor performance status, what we call performance status, with a very advanced disease for which there's no effective therapy, and the best therapy for them is end-of-life care, hospice care, and we try to set that up for them. It's other than ideal. But there are some other problems, more practical problems that interfere with our ability to have people involved with hospice care early on, and that's the practicality of being paid for your work. The Medicare hospice benefit will not cover anything but hospice care. So if the patients are in need of, say, radiation treatment because they have a very painful area where the cancer has spread in their leg or their back or wherever it has, they won't pay for that. They won't pay for chemotherapy, which may be given with with palliative intent and not curative intent. So there comes down to that very practical reason and problem of who's going to be paid for their services. So often hospice then gets put on the back burner. I still believe that it's of great value, and I try to do this in my practice. When we have gotten through all the discussions about the reality of the diagnosis, the prognosis, and their treatment options, such as they are, I still think it's of great value if they've gotten to the point where, okay, this disease is not going to be curable. Having a meeting with the hospice team, just so people know each other, and when the time comes, and their patients will know when the time comes, we can put everything in place. Care plans often overlap. What I mean by that is your physical care for the patient is going to lap with their psychological care is going to overlap with their spiritual care, and that's a very big thing. And there are things, though, that cause physical pain that may not be physical, and we'll get back to that in a little bit. We talk about the spokes of the wheel of pain, those things that are keeping pain real, keeping pain alive, if you will. That and many of these things are not necessarily physical. So what about physical care? The goal is to relieve symptoms caused by the progressive underlying illness, of course. And it's amazing, in my world, it can happen to people, and we always have to, back up a second, I apologize for this, but I always see groups like this as medical students or residents. So if I get into the medical, if I'm appearing to be more giving a medical talk, please forgive me for that. But what I want to say about this is, in terms of what pain is, we should keep in mind that it's not just physical. It has an emotional component to it. It has a financial component to it. It has a social component to it. It has a spiritual component to it. One of the hardest cases I had ever to offer pain control to or manage pain control with was a patient, and I didn't know this, whose son was in prison. And I didn't know that. I didn't know what the story was, but my patient's suffering over her son being in prison was interfering with our ability to help her with care. And once we were able to arrange a meeting with her and her son at the maximum security prison, it went a long way to having her pain become under control. And that's what we call part of the spokes of the pain wheel. What about emotional care? Well, our patients have a lot of anxiety. They have anxiety regarding the diagnosis and the prognosis. We'll say it one more time, probably will be the last time tonight. One of the most potent treatments that we can give our patient is composed of truth. Which I call the truth serum. We need to be sure that we're telling them the truth, to the best of our ability, the truth of their diagnosis and their prognosis. There's stress regarding the paperwork. You know, we those of us in the military, and I had one of my shipmates I had enjoyed my dinner with this evening. Of course, he was a real sailor. I'm retired Navy, but he was a real sailor. He did the real stuff. I was back at the hospital where it was warm and comfortable and dry. But we would say you can't die until your paperwork is done. And there's a lot of things to that paperwork. There are finances. But who's going to take care of the mortgage? God forbid if my wife passed away before I did. She knows where all of the financial stuff is. I haven't a clue. You know, who's taking care of the retirement funds? All these things need to be taken care of. There's the stress of developing a care plan with end-of-life discussions. How do we have end-of-life discussions? And then there are those family stresses, and I mentioned that one about the son who was in prison while his mom was fighting what ultimately would be a losing battle against cancer. So the family stresses, the relational stresses, and social and legal issues that all have to be settled. How many of, hopefully all of us have wills. So this summer I had a scare with my heart, and the first thing I did when I got home was make sure I signed my will, which had been sitting in my lawyer's office for 3 years without me signing it. So we got in there and made sure that was done. It's the stress, not just on the patient, on the one we're trying to take care of, but the stress on the family as well. But what about making decisions now regarding end-of-life care and end-of-life issues? As I mentioned already twice, and if I was giving a test, you'd probably get a test on this. It requires a full understanding on everyone's part of the diagnosis, prognosis, and treatment options. And what I mean by everyone's part is the family members need to know. Let me stop myself. I always tell my patients that I will not know more about their case than they know. I mean, they will know everything about their case that I know. And they will need to have, as part of the discussion, those family members who are going to be with them, part of their decision-making process, people they trust, maybe a best friend, maybe their lawyer, those people need to be part of those discussions. One of the worst things that we run into, and I think I mentioned this last year when I spoke, is what we call the daughter from Philadelphia phenomenon, or the daughter from Philadelphia syndrome, where they haven't seen mom in years, and now mom is in the last stages of her illness, and the daughter shows up and wants to change everything. She's going to find her the best specialists in the world, and she's demanding this and demanding that. And it's usually about midnight that this happens. Believe me, it always seems to happen at midnight. It's not the time to have discussions, but it happens. So you want to avoid that kind of thing, because you can only imagine the tremendous stress that's going to be put on your loved ones. It's just terrible. So everyone needs to be on the same page of music. Symptom management is not negotiable. And I'm going to say a little bit about this later, but what I mean by that is this is paramount. About 85% of our cancer patients, not all of our cancer patients, praise God, have pain as part of their illness, but most of them do. And I can tell you that for many of our advanced cancers, that morphine or adequate pain control, morphine is surrogate for pain control, that morphine can be more potent than any of our chemotherapy agents for this specific disease, as long as it is capable and is being used to the point where your patient has adequate pain control and adequate symptom management. Those patients live longer. Their quality of life is greater. They tend to not lose weight at the same rate that they do. But so this is not negotiable. And I tell my patients that one of the times, I'm going to throw this out there for the moment. Our patients do not get addicted to their pain medications, period, end of discussion. That is huge. And a lot of our patients are afraid of that. Their families are afraid of that. It just does not happen. I go in for hours-long discussion about why that doesn't happen, the physiology of that, but it doesn't happen. Often what happens is they don't get overdosed, they get underdosed. And so what's the point? If your pain is here and you're giving pain medication to here, it doesn't make any sense. One of the questions here is, when should clergy to be called? Well, a good time to provide spiritual care and ask for clergy for help and guidance is at that point where people are ready to make end-of-life care decisions. A good time to ask for clergy to come and see you or come and see your loved one is when the diagnosis has been made too. I think that's a very excellent time. It will start the preparation process for our people. So what should be covered? Well, Well, again, from the standpoint of a medical oncologist, one of the most important decisions is that regarding care, what treatment options should be used. And for us, it's if the disease is not curable, we balance the potential benefit against the potential side effects, and that's gigantic, believe me. And we have to keep in mind as well, and we'll throw this out too, that chemotherapy all too often is a surrogate for coping. That is how people are coping through their chemotherapy. And that ultimately eventually is not going to be a very comfortable or healthy place for our patients and their families to be. We also want to have an idea about code status. Do they want to be resuscitated in the event of a cardiac arrest? And if they are, if they do want to go on with what we call extraordinary means beyond resuscitation, would they accept being on a ventilator, being intubated, breathing only by the machine and not on their own, and being connected to a machinery and all kinds of monitors and things? You want them to get an idea, develop with you the role of the hospital in their care plans. And certainly in Alaska, but in most places where I've practiced, most of my patients want to be at home as long as they possibly can be at home. And many of them will say, I don't care, I want to die at home in my own bed, in my own home, with my family and friends and those I love with me. And I think that's a wonderful goal. And I think it's a goal that actually can be achieved as well. Also having some discussions about food and water. It seems so obvious. Food can become a battleground. And I experienced this frequently, and I experienced this in the fullness of it. When I was a first-year fellow, one of my very best friends eventually died of cholangiocarcinoma, a very unusual tumor in someone who's 28 years old, but that's what he had and that's what he died of. And food became a battleground between him and his wife. His wife would spend hours making him his favorite foods, and he wouldn't eat them, and she thought it was because he was just being obstinate. The reality was that the cancers take away, they produce cytokines, which take away our appetite, take away our ability to enjoy food, and they also take away the ability of food to actually nourish the patient. That's why they lose weight, despite all of our efforts to try to keep their nutritional status protected. That created tremendous stress between him and his new wife. I think they were married 6 weeks when he was diagnosed with the cancer. He lived 2 years after that. This was a horrible thing for them. And not knowing myself what to do, I couldn't help them. But I think my friend Mark has been with me many, many times over the years. I've been doing this for 40 years, many, many times since, helping people through this. And so food, the taking of food or the inability to take food should never become a battleground. It should never be a stressor. And again, we could talk for a very long time on the data regarding force feeding of patients with advanced diseases and not just cancer, and the ineffectiveness of it. In fact, in many cases, it actually shortens life for reasons that we don't quite completely understand, but they're becoming better elucidated. The same with water. And I can tell you in my deacon training program, my favorite professor was this 17-year-old professor from the University of Notre Dame who had 5 kids. He wasn't 17, he looked 17. Brilliant man. And we still keep in contact with each other. We would argue about the role of water for our patients in the end-of-life care setting. And I won't get into a discussion of the data on IV fluids and forced fluids with tubes and things. I won't get into that, but just to say that also should not become a battleground. If your loved one wants something special, like one of those things over there. If they want to eat that as opposed to the pizza, okay, fine. If they're thirsty, let them drink. If they're not thirsty, don't. In the end of life stages, don't press the issue. And then another very important topic to discuss is, when does ordinary care become extraordinary care? Now, there's no way on day 1 or even day 10 or even day 30, probably, that anyone is going to be able to make that decision. But these are things that we're throwing out on the table just to discuss that they're there. We may not be making any decisions this first day or the second day or the third day or the 5th time we're doing it, but we've heard what the issues are. And that this becomes maybe one of the most important things, because things that you would take for granted, like, well, of course, mom has pneumonia. Why wouldn't you give her antibiotics? Maybe it wouldn't. Maybe that would be her decision, and you've already covered that. Or of course, dad is bleeding internally. Why wouldn't you give him a transfusion? Well, maybe that's turf that you've already covered. And one of my patients as a house officer at the Naval Hospital in San Diego, who influenced me tremendously and probably influenced me as well to become an oncologist, even though I did so. This is another point of a time of discussion or something for discussion. I did so with my heels dug deeply into the concrete, saying, I'm not doing this, and being dragged into it. I did it anyway. But he was such one of those patients who had he had end-stage acute leukemia and bone marrow failure, actually, and he didn't have any platelets, and he couldn't protect himself, and he was bleeding, and he had to make a decision: how many units of blood am I going to take, or when is enough? So at face value, well, it's simple. He's bleeding, give him blood. Well, it's not so. It may not be so simple. In the end of life situation, an ordinary care plan becomes an extraordinary care plan. And just throwing that on the table early on, so that people are hearing this, I think that's of great value, so you're not getting it later on. Also, related to that is, what is futile? How far do we go? What is futile? When I was a professor in Texas, at medical school in Texas years ago, we took care of patients from the Bureau of Prison System in that part of Texas. We had a women's prison and we had a men's prison, and we had a standard that we had to go by determining futility. Futility is one of those things too that should be brought up early on in the conversation about, well, what are you going to want to do in the event that the chemotherapy no longer works? And we've already established with you that there really isn't any good other option. So where do you want to take this? How do you want to do this? So they have time to think about this. In time of incapacity, who makes the decisions? That's another thing that's very important in the care plan. That shouldn't be something thought about as dad is slipping into coma. That should already be established, and it should be established in writing. So speaking to that, how do we do that? Advanced healthcare directives can be filled out. You can find these things online. They can be provided by hospice teams. They can be found at the hospitals. Some of these things include what's called the portable medical orders, or the PULSE system. When I did some research on this, I was just curious how many states in the country have PULSE systems. But there's only a couple, but there are about 20, and I say, I'm being facetious. All the systems in place are the same, but they have different acronyms. There's PULSE and MOLST and POSE and those and these, and it cracked me up. There's about 20 of them. But Wyoming is a PULSE state, and it becomes a legal document. If they're easy to fill out, if you're good friends with your attorney and you'd like them to help you, it's a simple thing to do. But it gets put into writing, so that everybody's on the same page of music, and copies of these things can be made to give to your family members. I intend to do that myself. And those that you trust, the trusted part of your care team. And that is a very important thing to do. Now, a couple of key points here I should bring up before I wrap up. One is the decision process is not written in stone, never to be modified, okay? It's a dynamic process. And you think about this as, especially in my world with my cancer patients, they're on a trajectory, they're on a journey, and things are going to change along the way. So things that they said back in March may not be applicable in November because things have markedly changed. They've come to a place, hopefully, of serenity, of a surrender to our Lord. And eventually surrender to this world. We're done with this world. And so those things that we were talking about in March may no longer be applicable. Now, they may have told me in March, oh yeah, if I get a fever and I have an infection, I want to be in the hospital. If I'm bleeding, oh yeah, I want to be treated with blood transfusions. I want all that stuff. And heck yeah, if I have a cardiac arrest, I want to be resuscitated. Well, now no, in November, they may not be there anymore. And so we have to keep that in mind. Just because you wrote it and signed it, several months ago, doesn't mean that you can't change your mind. Right about the patients. So it's a dynamic thing. The doctor-patient relationship is extremely important and it's extremely valuable. So I'm going to preach a little bit because I'm a deacon, I can preach. But I've been preaching before I was a deacon about this. We can do so much through the doctor-patient relationship. And I think this is the time where your patients and their families need you most. And now I'm talking to you as if you're medical students and doctors. And it's not the time to hand this off to someone else. One of the hardest things for me in my practice is being sent a patient with whom I've had no relationship, or not yet. But they're as those first few years in Alaska for me it's right in the 11th hour. It's right before midnight for the patients, and it's really hard to establish your relationship with them because everything that we're done is working through this relationship. The last question I think we kind of covered is, what care should be provided and what we would call extraordinary care and what would we call not extraordinary care, and what things would be withheld. Hopefully we've established that that's also the answer is dynamic, that there are things here that may change. I think what we would never withhold is we would never withhold those things that are managing symptoms. That symptom management, as I said earlier on, is not negotiable. We do that. I have had patients, and I highly respect this. And again, it's part of the relationship that I've had with them, who, how can I put this? Wish to share in Christ's sufferings on his way to Calvary. And they see this as their time to share in his suffering. I greatly respect that. But they always know too that I'm going to be there when they say, I need a little bit of help, doc. I'm going to be there. We're not going to turn this over to somebody else who say, sorry, you already made up your mind. And I think we're not going to do that. So I'm happy to take any questions. I'm also happy that I didn't have to sit down, so that's good. Yes.
So that I interpret this correctly, I just recently filled out and I'm naturally dead. But if I'm in extreme pain, are they gonna look at that woman and say, oh, she wants an after death, you let her lay there and scream?
Yeah, no, that's a really good question. One of the things that touched my heart years ago in oncology is, let me back up just a second. I've been doing this since 1984, and we really didn't have palliative care programs. In fact, we didn't even know what it was. We didn't even know how to use pain medication. I learned how to use pain medication on the surgery service, not the place to use it for, not the place. It's not the stuff to learn for cancer patients. Okay. So the answer to your question is no. That's one of the non-negotiables. And because I heard from patients and families all the time, well, my aunt died screaming in pain. Oh, no. And it added to their anxiety about having cancer, especially advanced cancer, because they knew somebody who knew somebody who knew somebody who died a horrible death in horrible pain. That should never happen. There's so many things that we can do. And, there's a lot of concern about, well, if you give them morphine and you overdose them, you may shorten their life. It's about the goal. The goal is not to shorten their lives. The goal should never be to shorten their lives. The goal should always be to protect their dignity. And screaming in pain is not being in right? It's an indignity. And it's our responsibility to be sure that all of our patients' all our patients' dignity at all times should be guarded. And part of doing that is being sure that their symptoms are under control. It's like nausea and vomiting. Let your patient just throw their brains up for the next 3 days. No, that can't happen. We can't do that.
So our next speaker, you've heard her before, Susan Bigelow, has been a caregiver, and a year ago she was still caregiving for John. So it's not even been a year that she lost her husband. And John was also a deacon here, John Bigelow. But Susan has so much to share, and all through this year that I have to say that my respect for her and just my love for her and how she has handled. We're like, Susan, you need to take a little time to grieve. And she'll say, oh, I know. And I'm taking, and then that's just the way we are. And sometimes our own personalities don't give us that time. And I think that this has been a wonderful time for Susan to be able to share with you some of the things that she's already gone through. And she's here tonight to share a little bit more. So Susan, come on up. Thank you.
We have many caregivers who come and share their story. And last year I asked someone else if they would share their story about being a caregiver to their spouse at end of life. And she shared her story with me. But then when I asked her if she would share it with the group, she said, I just can't do that. And I've asked a few other people, and no, they just can't do that. And, so that's why I'm here. Again, sharing this story. This is a hard story to tell. But the reason we as former caregivers share our story with those who are caregivers now is because we hope you can learn from that. And so I have a few of these experiences. And last year, Deacon Greg may not know this, but my husband was such a huge cheerleader for us doing the Care for Caregiver workshops. And every week I would tell him what the topic was. I'd come down here early and get things done. Then I'd go home and take care of him, come back for the workshop. And I'd go home and I'd report how the workshop went. And the only workshop last year that John came to was this workshop with Deacon Greg. And just as I was getting up to give my caregiver testimony about my mother's end of life, John, who was on oxygen, his oxygen concentrator, the battery had run down. And I asked, does anyone else know how to change the battery in his oxygen? No, they didn't. So, okay, this was a great example of what a caregiver does. I said, just a moment, folks. And I exchanged his battery on his oxygen and then came back up and gave the talk. So I wanted to reflect just a little bit about end of life. And I know many of you have had many experiences of this. I have been blessed with being near my dad when he passed away in 2002 at the age of 85 in a nursing home. And my mother, when she passed away in 2018 in my home. and with my husband when he passed away in 2023 in the hospital. And they all died in their 80s and 90s. They lived long lives, and I would have loved to have had one more day with each one of them. But that wasn't my choice. And as I think about all three of them and that experience of being involved in their end of life is obviously a physical transition, but it is such a spiritual transition. And we have books over here that by Barbara Carnes, who's a pioneer in hospice. And the first time I heard about hospice was the day that my dad was dying in Spearfish in the nursing home. And he'd been in the nursing home for about 9 months. He would have passed away earlier, but we took him to the VA hospital. He had decided that he was done, and he quit taking all of his medication. Well, we took care of that. My brother went to his next doctor's appointment with him, and they put him back on all of his medications, and he was doing well. But he got the night before he was going to be released from the VA hospital, he got out of bed on his own and fell and broke a hip. And it took a couple days before he had surgery to repair his hip, and his body had already been starting to shut down, and that hip never repaired. It never healed, and so he went into a nursing home after that. But he was really very mentally alert. My dad loved playing cards. 2 or 3 weeks before he passed away, his sister, my dad, my mom, and I played cards, and I think he won. And so he was really very mentally alert. But he didn't hear well, and he and my mom had quit going to church a number of years before, and they weren't Catholic. John and I were Catholic. We no longer lived in Spearfish. We lived in Gillette. But a couple months before my dad passed away, he got my husband to the side of his bed and said, "John, could you have your priest come see me?" And so our good friend, Father Kerry Prendville, went to see my dad. And afterwards, he told John, he said, your father-in-law is in good shape. But it really made me think, my dad was putting his affairs in order. That he could still play cards, he could do all of that, but he knew that his end of life was soon. And so he wanted to see a pastor. And he wanted to have that end of life spiritual discussion. And so he did that. And then we got a call from my mom that said, the nursing home said your dad's near the end of his life. And so we gathered. He had 4 children, and they were in South Dakota. I was in Wyoming, my sister in Idaho, a brother in Cheyenne, and one in Colorado. Well, we all gathered. My dad's life had been ending for a long time by that time. So he didn't have this catastrophic end of life. He just had a gradual end of life. And he did have a morphine patch. He said to me one time, "Susan, they're giving me 11 pills a day." I said, "Dad, you got 11 things wrong with you." But they didn't, he didn't have IVs. He didn't have all of that. He had a morphine patch to help deal with the pain. And I believe that my dad chose the moment he died. We had a meeting with a hospice nurse in the afternoon. I was anxious. We went over to my mom's apartment, which was just the nursing home and her apartment were on the opposite side of the same parking lot. And so we met the hospice nurse over at the apartment. I wanted to be done with that because I didn't want to not be with Dad when he died. But everyone else seemed to ignore that whole idea that we were away. And so, but we talked with the hospice nurse, and she explained, what end of life what it would look like. And kind of just that if you're by the bedside and someone dies of natural causes, what that looks like, sounds like, etc. And so we went back to the nursing home, and And they moved, my dad shared a room and they moved someone out, the other person out of his room. And once again, I didn't want my dad to pass away while all of this moving stuff was happening. So I was a little bit anxious about that, but everything got moved. And my mom said, I'll sit with dad for a while. And all four of us kids were there. And so we all said goodbye to dad. And the four of us went out and sat in the dining room. And my mom sat beside my dad. And he died. And she came out and she told us, and she said, I'm so glad we visited with the nurse because I knew exactly what was going on. And I know my dad's major concern is all of their married life was that my mom was well cared for. And so I know that he waited until all four of his children were there so that we were there so we could be there for mom. And he didn't die when we were absent. He didn't die while they were moving people in and out of his room. They didn't die while there was commotion. He died a very peaceful, natural death with my mom sitting by his side. And she immediately had care from us. And so it is a spiritual journey. And I wish I had spent more time there. I think we went over once a week, but I look back, I think I kind of ignored my mom the year after my dad died because I had to reconnect with family, with children and grandchildren, but she was good. She did not blame me for that. And we stayed in touch quite a bit. Well, then my mom came to live with us. She wanted to stay in her apartment till the day she died. She didn't get to stay in her apartment because she had medical needs and she came to live with us. And God just answered so many of our concerns. I am watching the clock, but my mom was with us for 9 months and she wanted to stay in her apartment. Keep that in mind. She was with us for 9 months. The last month she was diagnosed with cancer that had already metastasized. And I appreciate, one of your comments about things that you don't really have to have. In the emergency room, when they told us that she had cancer, had already metastasized and her liver was full, I wanted to know where it had shown up. Well, it turns out it doesn't matter. It is now, cancer that's throughout her body, and it doesn't matter where it started. The mystery doesn't need to be solved. My mother, God bless her, said, well, I guess now we know what's going on. And the doctor said, your mom qualifies for a night in the hospital. Would you like her to stay in the hospital? I said, I think I would. Is that okay, Mom? Yes, it is. So she stayed the night in the hospital and I went home and cried about it and said, okay, now we have to have a new plan because, I was helping her recover from surgery and do all those kinds of things. Well, now we have to have a new plan. I went back to the hospital and we talked with the doctor, talked to my mom the next morning, and she went on hospice. And she was on hospice at home for almost 30 days before she passed away. And she passed, a few days before she passed away, she said, what do I owe you for this, Mom? I said, owe for what? She said, for my apartment. My mom got to pass away in her apartment. It was in my house, but it was still her apartment. And my mom and I had some wonderful conversations near the end of her death, end of her life. And so we certainly had DNR. We, decided that she was going to stay at home. There were no extraordinary, there were no bells and whistles. There were, she was going to die a peaceful death. We did use some morphine at the very end of her life. And, but they gave it orally and they gave me little needles, little bit, I don't know what little syringe, gave her just a itty bit. And it was enough that she was comfortable. And I want to talk just a moment. If you have a chance, please pick up these books. One of the things it talks about is the role of the end of life doula, DHOULA, I believe is the title. And an end of life doula can be a paid, a professional like a hospice nurse. but it's also, can be a family member. And if caring for your loved one, you look around and you can't tell who the doula is, it's probably you. You know, and the doula is the person, who with my mom, and my siblings and, you know, all of her grandchildren, they're the one who kind of orchestrates what's happening. You know, not only are they probably the one on the pulse, but they're also the one who encourages family to go in and sit beside mom. I know she's not talking, but she's listening. If you just go in and talk to her, you know, and if you have something to say to your dad, you need to say it on this trip. You know, if you haven't talked to them about something and it's really on your mind or on your heart, now's the time to talk to them about that. And also to have those spiritual conversations. My mom, who was a faithful person, but never really articulated her faith, asked some just wonderful questions at the end of her life. She said, you know, I go to sleep every night, Susan. I don't know if I'm going to wake up tomorrow. And then she said, do you think dying hurts? And then we talked about who she was going to see in heaven. And I remember when we talked about that, she said, oh, daddy. You know, she's going to see her daddy. You know, this is a 91-year-old woman, you know, looking forward to heaven because she's going to see her dad again. You know, and so having those conversations, you know, that's the doula's role, is to have those conversations and to help your loved one on their journey and to help to ease that journey. Of John and I were planning to do another motorhome trip when he went in the hospital last, let's see, he passed away on December 7th and he was in the hospital for a week. So end of November, he went in the hospital. We were planning on going on another motorhome trip. So we had our journey planned. But while we were planning that journey, he was also preparing for another journey. And while we were in the hospital, he wanted to pass away at home. But he also knew that he needed to go to the hospital sometimes when he had symptoms that could be treated. So he went in the hospital, and they tried treating him for what they thought was aspirational pneumonia. Well, it didn't take long to realize that his oxygen needs were increasing tremendously, and he had now become tethered to the hospital. Because taking him off, the amount of oxygen he was on in the hospital wasn't something we could do away from the hospital, and taking him off that oxygen would have caused his death. You know, so there came a understanding that John is not leaving the hospital, but he wanted to pass away at home. So he's at the hospital, and I am at home, and I know that he's not coming home, and it's December. So I just took Christmas to John and made the hospital home. And so there's a hospital room in there that probably still has Scotch tape in the window, because I took his favorite crocheted snowflake ornaments that I've crocheted over the years, and I just taped them to the window. And I said, you know, someone else is going to deal with this Scotch tape later. You know, and I took the angel that I had made for the top of our Christmas tree. They'd been on our Christmas tree for 33 years. And I just took it and I put it there, and I brought Christmas music on a Bluetooth speaker. And when my daughter-in-law came, it turns out she had a Christmas tree in the trunk of her car, and we brought it in and we set it up in the hospital. A phrase that they use in this book that I really hadn't heard until that time came with John, is comfort care. And it was about comfort care. And I shared this with Deacon Greg earlier, that there's some decisions that as the doula, you can make to just make sure that you are honoring your loved one's wishes. As John was getting ready to go to sleep the last night, there was a monitor that kept alarming. And I said, okay, so tell me what that alarm is. Well, when his oxygen goes below 85, the alarm goes off. And I'm thinking, it's going to keep going below 85. John's dying. And he's on all the oxygen they can put him on. You know, he's on the wall oxygen And they've got another one on top of that. You know, you can't get more oxygen and he's going to die. And so please, you know, just turn off the alarm. Okay. And they said, well, okay, how about if we come in and check on him every hour and a half? Okay. You know, but John wanted to be at rest. He wanted to be peaceful and to be at rest. And so they just agreed with that and we were okay. And I asked him, I didn't know that was his last night. And so I asked him, do you want me to spend the night? Yeah, that'd be great. And so so they made up a bed for me and it was so cold in the room because he was hot. And so he had the window open, but it was so cold in the room. You know, these are obvious signs of end of life. And in the book, one of the things it talks about is how the dying can really choose the moment of their death. And we were waiting for some kids to come home. I was hoping they would get here before John passed away. Some made it and some did not. And in hindsight, the ones who needed to be here were the right ones. The ones who I could call the hospital at 2:00 in the morning and we could make decisions about the funeral and time and scheduling the funeral and doing things like that. They made it. The ones who that would have been a traumatic situation for them did not make it until the next day. You know, so, you know, we think we're in charge, but we're really not. And so John passed away peacefully without me being awake. I wanted to be awake and be with him as he took his last breath. Turns out I got up and used the bathroom, went back to bed. The nurse came in and checked on John and woke me up and said, your husband's passed away. You know, and so I believe that my being there in the room with John was what allowed him to sleep peacefully. And he spared me being awake when he took his last breath. And so those end of life decisions really are about you knowing your loved one, honoring their wishes, trying to do for them, you know, for my mom to make her apartment in my home and for John to make home in the hospital and to make sure that they understand that you're okay with the journey and you're helping them with their journey because we can grieve after they're gone. But it's important for us, I believe, as caregivers, to really help our loved one make that journey well. So I know we're over time. I encourage you to pick up Barbara Carnes's books. They're easy reads and they are very, very, very well done. So sorry to make you sad, but I think these are very important decisions, very important topics. Thank you. Next week is all about veterans and veterans benefits. But before you leave tonight, you can turn around. There are plenty of leftovers over here on the table. And even if you don't have a veteran, have dinner with us next week. Good night.